Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Fight podcast. I'm joined by my friend Logos, and we're here to begin a two-part series on the problems with the libertarian non-aggression principle. Now, the first episode, the one we're doing today, will be on the sort of justification for the N.A.P. So, in the sort of heyday of internet debates, like 2005 2016, the libertarians and the socialists, were a large part of that debate scene. And the putative advantage of libertarianism was that they claimed they had clearly defined terms and ethical principles derived from logical axioms, which the socialists did not. Now, I think that was what got a lot of people to support that movement. But on further investigation, I don't believe that that's actually true at all. And I think that the main reason why somebody ought not to believe in the N.A.P. is because the N.A.P. has never actually been proven. Now, there's basically three attempts. I mean, there's presumably more, but the three that I'm familiar with of attempting to prove the N.A.P. are Rothbard in For New Liberty, Kinsella in his essay, How We Come to Own Ourselves, and Hoppe's Argumentation Ethics, which is detailed in his theory of socialism and capitalism. And we'll deal with each one in turn. Now, in pages 33 and 34 of For New Liberty, which I think is short enough that we can at least bear repeating some of what Rothbard says, he says, the most visible method of elaborating the natural rights statement of a libertarian position is to divide it into two parts, and to begin with the basic axiom of the right to self-ownership. The right to self-ownership asserts the absolute right of each man by virtue of his or her being a human being to own his or her body, that is, to control that body free, of course, of interference, since each individual must think, learn, value, and choose his or her ends and means in order to survive and flourish. The right of self-ownership gives man the right to perform these vital activities without being hampered and restricted by coercive molestation. Okay, let's just stop right there. The first problem that I see with this argument is when Rothbard says, since it is each individual must think, learn, value, and choose his or her own ends to survive and flourish, that's not true at all. For example, animals survive and flourish without seeking or choosing or thinking about their own ends. And since man is a rational animal, one could argue that man ought to just live an animalistic life. That you may not like that. It may not be what is desirable, but there's no logical contradiction in saying that that's your position. And there might also be some people that are just, of an inferior rational capability where they can't think in those terms. If somebody else were to tell them what to do, they'd be happier. And so the claim that the right to self-ownership gives the man the right to do that is also begging the question, because why ought we to think that man owns his productive labor? Animals don't, and animals survive and flourish just fine without owning their productive labor or their bodies. So I think right out of the gate, this first part of the articulation of Rothbard is really flawed. Is there anything you want to add about that, Logos?
Yeah, sorry, I was jotting some things down on my notes so I didn't forget while you were talking, because you brought up a lot of interesting points, especially while reading the passage. Three things I want to bring up real quick about this is, so you mentioned that the N.A.P. hasn't been proven, and a possible preemptive libertarian response to this might be, well, it's a principle, we don't have to prove anything. And my thought on this is actually something we talked about last night, and we've talked about very often, in fact, is the fact that the non-aggression principle, however it seems to be cashed out in the literature, doesn't seem to be properly basic. You've got socialists and all sorts of people that either deny it or claim to accept it, but they have a different definition of, say, coercion, right? Because Rothbard uses the word coercion. People have the right to do X without being coerced. And a left libertarian, like, say, a Brenton Langel figure or something, could say, right, we absolutely agree with that. And here's what coercion means, to which, Rothbard would, throw his hands up in absolute disgust. And so whatever else the N.A.P is supposed to be, insofar as it's a principle, it's certainly not agreed upon as what we'd call a principle. I think most people understand what the law of non-contradiction means, or the induction principle for the rational numbers mean, or the natural numbers means, or anything like that. When you talk about a principle, there seems to be a universal understanding and application, and some people can accept it or reject it and so forth, but at least we all know what it means. But the N.A.P doesn't even seem to have that minimal requirement for a properly basic belief that would make it a principle in the same relevant sense. That's the first thing I want to note from his passage and the idea of provability. The second thing I want to note is what you were getting at about his idea that in order to have a life of self-directedness and flourishing and the rest of it, right? The first thing I thought of, actually just today, this wasn't even rehearsed, when you're reading that passage, was David Hume. And David Hume thought that the passions controlled people. The passions are the elephant, and the rational, beliefs and whatnot are kind of like a timid, scared, crapless rider riding this elephant as it's, rampaging around. Now, if one holds to that Humean belief that the irrational impulses are basically the primary driver of humanity anyway, well, now what? I mean, if the entire N.A.P is supposed to safeguard this ability for human beings to be rationally directed, and a Humean might say that we're fundamentally irrationally directed, then you're going to have a big problem. I think this is why Hoppe, which we'll talk about later, starts by attacking the emotivist idea of ethics to try to undermine that. But I didn't see an attempt to do so in Rothbard. And if it's not done successfully, as I don't think Hoppe did, and Rothbard didn't even try, then plenty of what could be atheistic libertarians or just other non-libertarians in general that assent to the Humean model of irrational oughts, so to speak. You can't drive an ought from an is, and so on and so forth. They would object to this just in principle. It's not even going to do the job for a Humean, because they don't think there is this self-directed rational right and flourishing and whatnot. The last thing that we'll probably talk about maybe a little later, but definitely in episode 2 of this, what I want the listener to really think about as a central focus here is, what does it mean to say it gives people the right to X without coercion? I don't know what that means, right? And so we'll talk about this later, but just for a simple example, suppose you've homesteaded your land, you've found a wife, you have a family, the Assyrians or Genghis Khan or whoever rolls up on your land and says, yeah, we're going to take your stuff and your wife, right? And there's not much you're going to do about that. Now, if the libertarian says, look, I've got the N.A.P and the N.A.P gives me the right to this flourishing, in what sense does it give them the right to this flourishing if this, unrelenting force says, no, we're just going to take it from you? What does right mean? Is right a moral ought? Because if it's a moral ought, how can a principle give an ought? If you believe in the is-ought gap, first of all, but secondly, if people just either believe a different version of the principle, deny the principle, so on, then your belief in the principle isn't going to secure your right to anything. If rights are just descriptive, as some libertarians say, then okay, it's just saying what you can do, but it's not actually guaranteeing you anything without coercion. And descriptive things don't even say you ought to be coerced, because descriptive statements aren't ought-like statements. So this whole clause about the N.A.P gives somebody the right to anything, I just don't know what it means. And without belaboring the point too much, I think I'll stop there. But those are the 3 first things that jumped out at me.
All right. Now, Rothbard then tries to imagine 2 possible alternative positions to his own. And the first one, he writes, consider to the consequences of denying each man the right to his own person. There are then only 2 alternatives. 1, a certain class of people, A, has the right to own another class, B, or 2, everyone has the right to own his own equal quotal share of everyone else. So the first alternative implies that while Class A deserves the rights of being human, Class B is in reality subhuman, and therefore deserves no such rights. But since they are indeed human beings, the first alternative contradicts itself in denying fundamental human rights to one set of humans. Moreover, as we shall see, allowing Class A to own Class B means that the former is allowed to exploit and therefore live parasitically at the expense of the latter. But the parasitism itself violates the economic requirement of life, production, and exchange. Well, the first problem with a lot of this here is, one, we're already asking about, Rothbard's begging the question about, Class B being subhuman. Because how do we know sub B, class B, is actually human at all, right? We're first demonstrating what it means to be a human, to have rights. So you're assuming that B is human, but what if maybe the old argument of slave masters was right? That because, the slaves had an inferior level of intellect, they're not really fully human anyhow. And given that they make a lot of claims, as we'll see later, based on intellect, maybe that does leave room for the slave master to say that, the Negro or the Slav is not a real human because they're not rational enough. And then second of all, the idea that parasitism violates basic economic requirements for life, that's just patently absurd. Nature is full of parasites, actual animals that derive sustenance from taking and not giving from other animals. And the life of the host the parasite kills the host and the parasite dies. So there's nothing about parasitism in principle that is contrary to life, whether it's animal life or any other kind. So again, that's just blatantly begging the question. And then the last part he has here is the second alternative, what we might call participatory communalism or communism, holds that every man should have the right to his own equal equivalent share of everyone else. If there are 2 billion people in the world, then everyone has the right to 1/2 billion of every other person. In the first place, we can say this idea rests on an absurdity, proclaiming that a man is entitled to his own part of everyone else, yet not entitled to own himself. Secondly, we picture the viability of such a world in which no man is free to take any action whatsoever without prior approval or indeed command by everyone else in society. It should be clear that that sort of communist world, no one will be able to do anything and the human race would quickly perish. Looking at that, I guess the problem would be, what contradiction arises by saying that you can't own yourself, but you can own someone else? There's no logical necessity that that's a contradiction. It may seem strange, it may be odd, but it's not strictly contradictory in a sort of like Kantian sense of, prescribing a moral behavior for someone else that you then intentionally violate, therefore violating the categorical imperative. And, furthermore, the idea that, it's not really viable because we have to wait for everybody else to give a decision, that you don't need to read that thought experiment that way. You could just say, well, just in the same way that shareholders all have some share in the company, you don't have to constantly, the CEO doesn't constantly have to ask every shareholder every single day what he's allowed to do. As long as he generates a profit, the shareholders are generally happy. So I think it's a kind of a straw man that Rothbard sets up only to knock down on the two alternatives Rothbard gives, Logos.
Yeah, exactly. And more to add to what you were saying, I want to go back to the first horn of Rothbard's possible alternatives here, where if you have Class A owning Class B, he says that's a contradiction because you think you have human rights, but you're denying other people human rights. Well, that's not true. The question is, if some Class A thinks they can own Class B, the question is, what did they believe in the first place? They might just hold as an axiom that some people can own other people, right? And that is a human right. Powerful humans can own weaker humans, right? So you could say powerful humans have a right to own weaker humans. And if Rothbard says, well, holding that view denies human rights, that's not a contradiction. They never believed in human rights anyway, not as a general rule. And so that's like an A, and there's no P and not P contradiction formed there. So that's just absurd. You never got it what the person believes that would contradict itself. All you've shown is that its belief is inconsistent with the general theory of human rights. Duh, that's not a contradiction. The other thing I want to point out about that as well, actually to piggyback on your point that you were bringing up on this, because this made me think of something different, is we have what we're going to see in libertarianism, especially in episode 2, is this whole circularity problem, a catch-22 issue, right? Let's consider a possibility. Well, let's start with this. Are animals within the scope of the N.A.P? No, because as Rothbard and other libertarians will explain, animals don't develop a system of language. They can't engage in contracts. They can't mutually acquiesce to other people's rights and so forth, right? So they're outside the scope of the N.A.P, so you can use beast of burden and so on. So I want to think about a thought experiment here, Todd. Let's suppose a person captures a baby, right? Captures a baby. Now, here's a question. Can babies rationally assent to their own course in life? Can they produce for themselves? Can they do everything that Rothbard says the N.A.P is meant to uphold for babies? No. Babies are parasitic on their mother. They can't form language. They don't rationally think. They don't, all that good stuff, right? So babies, whatever else is the case, are definitely outside the scope of the N.A.P, and they're kind of like, there's debate in libertarians about what exactly the status of children are to their parents, but there's some kind of quasi ownership or stewardship there in a way that they would think adults don't have with other adults. Okay, so let's suppose a parent kidnaps a baby. Not a parent, but a stranger kidnaps a baby, locks it in a cage, minimally feeds it, but never teaches it language, social customs, or even the need for such things. Lets it be completely feral, right? And so it grows into a quasi-animalistic being. Now, it has human DNA, it has all the markings of a human being, but we have this catch-22 where because this child was captured and turned into a beast of burden, it lies outside the scope of the N.A.P. It can't rationally think in the way humans think. It hasn't been taught how. It hasn't been educated. It doesn't have a language and so forth. So we have this issue where you can capture people before they're the kind of thing the N.A.P talks about, and you can raise them to be the kind of thing the N.A.P, doesn't talk about. And we actually do have a legitimate issue where if to be human in the Rothbardian sense is to engage in this rational behavior, you can actually make human beings not human and thus able to be owned by other humans via this catch-22 mechanism, which is always a problem I have with these kinds of constructions. And in this instance, you have where you have some class of humans A owning another class of humans B. They have human DNA, but they've been captured and cultivated from childhood to be the exact type of subhuman that Rothbard's warning us about by his own construction, not subhuman relative to an arbitrary constraint, but subhuman relative to Rothbard's own construction. And that's where that happens. Quickly, so I don't spend too much time here, I want to talk about the second horn. And it's not the case. Like Fezer will talk about later, you'll go into Fezer and talk about how people can unequally own other people, but there's something even more basic than that. Instead of thinking that everybody has an equal right to everybody else in the second horn, what if we just think that some people have more rights to other people's labor than others? So, for example, the family, right? It was a very, very classical notion that undergirded antiquity and all sorts of human flourishing, that family had obligations to each other, or in the language of libertarianism, members in the family had certain familial rights to the labors and other things that their family provided. But those family rights didn't extend perfectly outward. They might have been a slightly watered down version of the tribe, right? So they had rights as part of being in a tribe to certain things. And then more watered down rights as you get out from the tribe. Maybe, so like say in the Bible, you've got like the 12 tribes of Israel. You've got a family within a tribe. You're in one of the 12 tribes, and you're also an Israelite. And each of those concentric things gives you the rights in some weak sense, weaker as you get further out, to other people's labor. So this whole assumption that you have to have equal right to everybody else's labor is absurd, and nobody would even think that, right? Like, does an Israelite have a right to non-Israelite stuff? I don't think so. I think their covenants are, internal relative to each other in the first place. So you don't have like Israelites saying we have the right to the labor of the Egyptians, the Canaanites, or anything like that. But insofar as we're all Israelites, God commands us to do X for each other. And so that's a way you can have it. So we have this whole antiquity view that Rothbard just completely and utterly ignores. And that's a huge problem that Fezer will talk about in his own way systemically, but he doesn't talk about this relationship in quite this way, so I wanted to mention it.
Yeah, exactly. And we will get to right now Fezer's response. So Fezer argues that in an essay that he wrote, Rothbard as philosopher, where he argues that Rothbard was a crummy philosopher. And I think Fezer makes a pretty strong case that he was one. He points out that when it comes to possible alternative modes of property relations that to the self-ownership principle, Rothbard leaves out 4. 1 is nobody can own anybody. 2, God owns us. 3, one class has partial right to ownership over some other class. And then 4, everyone has the right to bodily autonomy, but not to the produce of their labor, which is owned in common. Now, 2 was held by Locke, the godfather of liberal thought. So for Rothbard to be ignorant of that position is just shamefully ridiculous. There's really nothing to be said about that. 3, one class has a right to partial ownership of some other class. And 4, everyone has a right to bodily autonomy, but not to the produce of their labor, which is owned in common, are both expressed in various elements of classical and ancient societies, which, again, Rothbard should have been familiar about. Now, one author who proposed nobody owns anybody is Professor Mavrodos. Rothbard purported to refute Mavrodos, and his argument was, well, if nobody can own anything, we'd all go extinct, which is just begging the question. Because, and to quote, I quote Fezer quoting Rothbard, Rothbard's replies to say that since ownership signifies range of control, would mean that no one would be able to do anything and the human race would quickly perish. Well, that's, again, obviously fallacious. Animals have range of control, which does not signify ownership, and animals do just fine surviving and flourishing. Now, again, what seems to me the case here with Rothbard is either A, it proves too much. It proves that animals have rights too, because animals have range of control. Animals can do all these things. Or it proves too little, that, well, against maybe some sort of hyper intelligence, an AI robot or an alien race, where their mental faculties surpass ours surpass monkeys, we wouldn't have any rights vis-a-vis them. Because, oh, well, you're just too dumb. So just like animals are too dumb, we can use them and eat them. They could use and eat us. And neither one of those are propositions Rothbard would want. And then I guess the third thing Rothbard proves, which again is too much, is that if flourishing is at stake and we can't flourish if we can't own the fruits of our labor, it's also the case that we can't flourish without food, clothes, shelter, and an education. So by the same logic of necessity, he's also proven several core principles of positive rights that socialists are fond of.
Yeah, you got that mostly. What I would say, the only thing I want to say is maybe I would express what you're getting at with the nobody owns anything rebuttal as a dilemma. So either Rothbard says that animals don't exhibit a range of control over their environment, or they do exhibit a range of control over their environment. If animals don't exhibit a range of control over let's start with the other one. If animals do exhibit a range of control over their environment, then as you say, animals would have rights. And if animals don't exhibit a range of control over their environment, by definition, then they ought not to be flourishing if surviving and flourishing, if flourishing is is a necessary precondition for flourishing is this range of control. So either they don't have it, why are they flourishing? Or they do have it, why don't they have rights? And that's kind of the dilemma that he set himself up for. And I think that's a good way of
Yes.
formalizing what you're trying to say.
Exactly. The next argument we're going to cover is Kinsella's How We Come to Own Ourselves. Now, it's a little bit longer of a read than Rothbard, so I'm not gonna actually read everything he says, but Kinsella argues that we have the objective link, and he derives the objective link as a precondition for the first user principle in libertarian property rights acquisition. And he argues that the objective link has essentially two components, which then demonstrates that the I in this case has a better claim to my body than someone else does. Some or any part of my body obeys my will. He gives an example from Hoppe, where if you say that this is your body, and then you say, well, how do you prove it? Well, you prove that it obeys some dictate of your will. So if I say I'm going to will to put my spoon in a bowl of soup and eat it, you verbally say it and then you do it, and say somebody else says, well, I'm going to, do the same thing and eat from the bowl of soup with your hand, but it doesn't do anything, then it proves that it's your arm and your hand and that you have a better claim to it. and then that my relation to my body is immediate. And immediate in the sense that if somebody were to interact with my body, they would have to interact through some mediated way, either by, grabbing me or touching me or negotiating with me or using some sort of mechanism to interact with me. Whereas I can do it immediately through this sort of immediate sensation and experience. He also quotes Hoppe, where Hoppe says, well, what if we have three guys, Mueller, Meyer, and Schultz, and, I say that this is my arm, and I raise my arm, and none of their arm raises. But imagine another scenario where I raise my arm and say Meyer's arm rises. Well, that would, according to Hoppe, prove that I have a better claim to Meyer's arm than my own. This creates all sorts of problems. I mean, first of all, do you lose control of your arm when it's broken? Because if you have a broken arm, you can't raise it. Do you then lose self-ownership rights over your arm because it doesn't respond to your will? Or if it's sedated, so it's numb and it doesn't respond to anything, do you lose it? That's not clear. And then furthermore, we can say, well, there's a couple of thought experiments we could run here. One is using Isaac Asimov's Science 5 villain, the Mule, who's a psychic genius. He takes over the entire galaxy by mind controlling people so that they do exactly as he would will them to do. Notice, no aggression has occurred because the objective link is the precondition by which one determines aggression. So the libertarian would have to admit that this intergalactic tyrant is completely justified in everything that he does, which would be a very unsettling thing to admit for a libertarian. And furthermore, we have the science fiction film District 9, where the protagonist is basically transforming himself into one of the aliens that are in concentration camps. And part of the feature of this alien is that their arm is a biomechanical weapon. And so he's kidnapped by the South African government. And then they strap him into a chair and run electrical current through his arm to activate the gun to shoot the other aliens downrange. And you can see in the film that he's visibly resisting shooting his alien gun arm, but he can't stop it because of the electrical current being charged to the arm. The South African government has a better claim to his arm than he does. So at least at the moment in which they're using him to shoot other aliens, they're not committing an act of aggression. Because again, they have demonstrated that they can control his arm better than he can. Again, this is a very unsettling thing for libertarians to want to accept. So I would argue that far from demonstrating self-ownership principle, the objective link actually is more muddled and confused than even Rothbard.
I agree. Yeah, the very fundamental problem with this principle is the is-ought gap. How do we go from it is the case that X has good control over Y to it ought to be the case that X has good control over Y? And that's not just a technical Lashley kind of question. Let me give you a really non-trivial thought experiment here that actually does happen in real life, because I remember that Kinsella was not happy with your science fiction examples. Here's an easy one. There's two very basic and practical thought experiments, right? Let's suppose you go to the doctor for a visit, right? You brought up sedation. I'm going to run with that because it's prescient. Suppose you go in there for an operation, a surgery, or something. The doctor sedates you. As you say, if your whole body is sedated, you have no control over your body. You're sleeping. You're usable for anybody, which really does beg the question, like, what happens when you just fall asleep at night, right? If you fall asleep and don't wake up and somebody, I don't know, molests you in some way in your sleep, did they actually aggress against you given you didn't have the primary control over your body? That's another question. For now, let's look at the more insane example, right? Suppose the doctor, while you're sedated, basically kidnaps you and then ties you to a chair, right? Well, you wake up, you're still tied to this chair. Well, you don't have control over your body. You've lost your objective link. You might will to lift your arm all you want, but the doctor's mechanism is stopping you. It's superseding your will. It's the primary control over your arm. And while you're strapped to this chair, the doctor performs an experiment on you to implant a bunch of electrical stuff into your body, right? Now, we can actually do some of this in real life. So one example I wanted to bring up with the whole I would lift my arm and I do, that's really important. Let's not get into the free will debate. Let's agree that some people who may even be atheist libertarians might actually question whether we actually do in fact have free will, and will is the primary controlling of our faculties. And there's some experiments that shed some real epistemic question marks on this. So here's an example. There's an experiment I've heard about where people are sitting in a chair, and researchers will use magnets to stimulate some neural part of somebody's brain to agitate their legs to make them want to stand up, so to speak. Now, the ultimate cause of their standing up is the physiological connection from the magnet to the brain. The scientists know the second we flip the switch, the magnets exercise this part of the brain, they'll stand up within blah, blah, blah seconds. And sure enough, like clockwork, every time the subject always stands up. Now here's the interesting part of the experiment. When the scientists asked the subject, hey, why'd you stand up? The subject, not knowing there were magnets present in the room, come up with a story about how, they were uncomfortable and they just wanted to stand up. They're just tired of sitting in the chair, right? It was an act of the will. So sometimes things can be acts of the will that aren't actually acts of the will. They're actually physiologically stimulated by something else. Now, it can be something as explicit as Todd's District 9 example, or my electrode example. Suppose somebody puts magnets and electrodes in someone's body, in the way we can kind of do with the experiments, but taken to an extreme, to take continual control over their body. Somebody goes to the doctor, they have a contract, right? And this actually gets to my overall catch-22 problem with this view. You have a contract with the doctor. The doctor ought to follow through with this contract, or they're violating the N.A.P. But the question is, violating the N.A.P. against who? Because if the doctor is successful in violating this contract against the patient and actually ends up like taking over their body with magnets and electrodes and whatever, using them like a puppet, while they're asleep, well, then by the time they wake up to realize their contract's been violated, they no longer have a right to be morally outraged at the violation of the contract. There is no them with a primary link to themselves to press charges or to claim victim status. Somebody else on the person's behalf, hey, my friend came to you for surgery. And the doctor can just say, hey, your friend, no. Your friend is actually my friend, my puppet. I have the primary control over his body. Your friend no longer actually exists as an entity to be wronged in my violation of the contract. And that's one of the catch-22 problems with this kind of N.A.P. construction. Okay, well, if this whole discussion of electrodes and magnets, despite the experiments we're already running in neuroscience, okay, put those, if that's still too much for you, let's put that off the side. Let's do a simpler one. Again, let's go back to the farmer example. You're a farmer, you have property, you have a wife, you have a family, and let's suppose some Assyrians or some Genghis Khan people or whoever, the Huns, they come over and they take your stuff. They kill you. They take your property. They take your wife. Kill your children. Want to have new children with the woman. Whatever. Okay, you're supposed to have a moral right to your property under the N.A.P, but you're dead, right? So if somebody else comes to the property, they can even see your dead body on the property. You could be strung up on a pole or something, and they could, some Hun retiring there, living a farmer's life there, and they can say, hey, wasn't this somebody else's property? Is that guy hanging up in the pole? And the Hun says, yeah, but there's no victim here because this guy no longer has primary control of the property. I do. So I own the property. I'm the one you're negotiating with. I'm the one with current rights to the property. So if on the behalf of a dead man who no longer controls the property, you want to try to renegotiate property rights with me, basically you're trying to remove my objective link that I now objectively have with this property. You're trying to use two wrongs to make a right. You're trying to violate my N.A.P, which I've just kind of taken for myself by force, by removing the link from the other person, and you're just trying to take my link. But if the objective link is the gold standard, then you can't retroactively take this guy's objective link to the property. And this is the catch-22 problem that's inherent in Kinsella's version of the N.A.P. It was also there in my example with Rothbard's. It's there in Kinsella's. It's going to be there in Hoppe's. Every one of these N.A.P constructions, because of what they consciously try to exclude cynically, will always structurally have a similar catch-22 problem just like this. There's no saving it.
Well, there's also one other problem. The objective link proves too much. He says the objective link has two components. Some part of my body obeys my will. My relationship to my body is immediate. Animals have both. And yet, Kinsella will deny that animals have rights. Again, what differentiates animals from humans such that animals either have rights-making properties but still don't have rights, or they don't have rights and they still flourish and survive? this is a recurring problem that's never going to get answered. And we see that with Kinsella on this one, animals also should have rights, but they don't. Now, when we look at Hoppe and his argumentation ethics, actually, I think I'll throw this one for you to start, Logos. I spent more time on his actual formulation of argumentation ethics, not debunking emotivism. So I think I'll let you start with Hoppe on this one.
Okay. Yeah, so the first thing Hoppe tries to do is debunk emotivism, but he comes at it completely wrong-headedly. So let me pull up my notes here so I can, read what he said and my reactions to it, because there's a lot in there, so I have to organize my thoughts here, right? Okay. Yes, so the first question that immediately struck me is, why is he starting with okay, so the first thing that's an oddity, but it's not really, a super criticism, is he's trying to talk about rights as matters of justice, and then he starts talking about like emotivist ethics as if they're a way to evaluate it. And my first response was, why? Emotive ethics don't really care about justice with a capital J. They're more concerned with our irrational, instinctual reaction to moral questions. That's something that struck me as a little strange. Now, he says that emotivism is derived from empiricist positivism. Now, I don't think that's true. You could be an emotivist pragmatist, for example. You don't have to be an empirical positivist. In fact, I have some sympathies toward emotivism, at least as a descriptive idea of how we do morality, especially in light of like Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind and other works like that. Even if it's not like a fundamental grounding of what moral statements are, it seems to be some description about how human beings initially process new moral situations. They kind of lean on their own instincts and so forth. But I would not consider myself an empiricist positivist. I think I'm a pragmatist, and pragmatism says that empiricism. Basically the criticism here is sense data does not provide its own interpretation, and so pragmatists who believe that, as I do, can't be empiricists who think that everything can be derived from the senses. So that's just wrong on its face. That's a technicality. Then he defines empiricist positivism defined as all statements whatsoever defined by are defined by being empirical or analytic. Now, this isn't true. It's not a definition of statements. It's a definition of statements' meanings or meaningful statements. It's a question of how are we to interpret this statement as meaningful, right? And Ayer really pressed this, right? So all statements that are meaningful, that we can actually derive meaning from and articulate and talk about, are statements of these following kinds. Now, here's the intuition pump behind like why somebody might think this, even if I disagree, by the way. It's not like I'm an empiricist positivist, but here's why somebody might think this, which Hoppe never really addressed. So if you're trying to talk to somebody about something using propositions, if you look at philosophy of language, especially Wittgenstein, post-Wittgenstein, a very important consideration is public versus private facts. So private facts, Todd, we've had discussions about the mind and so on. Private facts are kind of like qualia that are inherent to us, that nobody can kind of pry out of us or know exactly in the way that we know it. Somebody might know that we're eating a pizza or tasting barbecue sauce or something, but they will never know what it's like to taste pizza or barbecue sauce in the way that you or I individually do, which is why we can eat the same pizza and have a different experience. One of us likes it, one of us doesn't, and so on. If you're going to talk to other people meaningfully, rationally about things, you have to have meaningful or public. Public would be probably the more modern understanding. They have to be public propositions that two people can look at the same way, come to the same meaning. And so if you have disagreements about the proposition, the disagreements are kind of like on the record, right? We're looking at the same thing and saying, no, you're wrong, right? There's like a non-trivial, reconcilable disagreement there about public facts. And the candidates for those on the fork are empirical and analytic statements. So if somebody says, well, Fred is a married bachelor, but we both agree on a definition, a bachelor is an unmarried man, then Fred can't be a married bachelor, right? Because we have this public agreement about what definitions mean, which is why definitions and analytic statements as a generality are a good branch of the fork. Another branch would be empirical statements. And the reason why is because of data and reproducibility. So if somebody says, well, I don't know, a bowling ball and a feather would fall at different speeds in a vacuum, right? well, we could create a vacuum and perform the experiment, and look, we're both seeing the same bowling ball, the same feather. We're watching them fall in a vacuum, something we agree on is a vacuum by some criteria, analytically speaking. And we can just see what the result of that experiment is. So that's why empirical statements are a good candidate for meaningful in the is public sense. Now, philosophers have discovered some interesting counterexamples, which might muddy the waters a little bit in terms of synthetic a priori statements and so forth. Like water is H2O, for example, is a statement where nobody would understand if they knew, unless they knew about protons, electrons, and so forth. So a Greek or a medieval scholastic or something wouldn't understand what H2O even means, and so they might disagree with the statement analytically. But once they have the empirical understanding of electrons, then they would agree. Well, it's not strictly empirical because they think it's a difference of definitions. And it's not strictly analytic because the agreement on the definitions is predicated also on empirical facts, and so it's kind of a weird gray area. So I reject this setup that this is all an empirical positivist thing. Other people can take this even if they disagree. But what's really relevant here about the problem? The problem Hoppe is trying to set up here is that emotive ethics. So moral statements. What are we to make of moral statements, right? The emotivist would say that moral statements aren't meaningful statements in the way that these other things are meaningful, right? In the way that I set up as public information. So when you say that's murder, right? So we both look at a crime. We can both look at the same crime on a camera, right? And someone says that's self-defense, and someone else says no, that's cold-blooded murder. This isn't a statement of like murder is wrong. This is like a that is murder statement. What are we to make of these moral disagreements? This is where Hume's problem of the is-ought gap comes from. You can say the same is gaps about someone stabs somebody in the chest at such and such time at night. Two people could see that exact same happening and come to completely different conclusions about it. So there's nothing directly empirical that's telling us what the outcome is, and there's nothing analytic that's telling us what the outcome is. There's no definition that when Carl stabs Fred at 6 o'clock at night on a Thursday, by definition, like a bachelor, it must be murder or self-defense. There's all sorts of other things that go into it. And there's some kind of subjective qualia element in the evaluation of this. And so positivists, even if we're going with positivists and Humeans or pragmatists or whoever, I think a lot of people in this broad category would agree that moral statements at the gut level aren't meaningful in the way the other two are meaningful. And so by saying all propositions must be on this fork, it's automatically a straw man. What we're saying is the immediate moral instincts, the immediate moral dispositions when seeing something happen in front of us can't fit neatly into either category. So they're not meaningful in the public sense of meaningful. They're meaningful in a private qualitative sense of meaningful. And so when Hoppe goes on to try to find some internal contradictions with the statements and try to basically they try to show that this position is as self-refuting as a positivist position is, which should tell you that it's proving too much, because pragmatists and people who would agree with the self-refuting aspect of positivism could also hold it for other reasons. So I don't think, to tie it up in a bow, this might deserve a video all its own. I feel I'm going on too long. To tie this up in a bow, Hoppe's baseline refutation of the emotivist position, especially in light of atheists, Humeans, neuroscience, and so on, making this very, very muddled and complicated, it doesn't do a good enough job.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Logos. The beginning core argument that I see for argumentation ethics is that Hoppe is attempting to demonstrate that a performative contradiction arises by the interlocutor if he denies Hoppe's self-ownership rights. So if a socialist is going to debate Hoppe, then he's going to say, and I'm quoting from page 159 of The Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, thus it can be stated that whenever a person claims that some statement can be justified, he at least implicitly assumes the following norm to be justified. Nobody has the right to uninvitedly aggress against the body of any other person, and thus to limit or restrict anyone's control over his body. This rule is implied in the concept of justification as argumentative justification. Justifying means justifying without having to rely on coercion. In fact, if one formulates the opposite of this rule, everybody has the right to uninvitedly aggress against other people, then it is easy to see that the rule is not and could never be defended in argumentation. To do so would in fact have to presuppose the validity of precisely its opposite, the aforementioned principle of non-aggression. Okay, so the first thing here is it's begging the question. One does not need to implicitly assume self-ownership to argue with somebody peacefully in order to solve a dispute. In fact, really all anybody needs to implicitly assume is that for their own self-preservation, it's better to resolve a fight non-violently than violently. Because, for example, even if you talk to ex-US service members, they'll be like, look, don't pick a fight if you don't have to, because even some chump might get the lucky kill shot on you and your life's over. Right? It might, the guy may have like no beginner's luck, right? He starts popping off the AK-47 and he kills you. So all you have to minimally assume is that since you don't want to die today, you should peacefully negotiate with this person to solve the problem. That's all you minimally have to assume. And then second of all, Logos, I know you have a lot to say about this one. Hoppe just completely misunderstands what a contradiction is. His first statement can be construed as no S is P. And according to the square of opposition, the contradiction to no S is P is not all S is P, but some S is P. So Hoppe just clearly misunderstands what opposite means in a rigorous, logical, formal sense. In fact, I mean, this is like a sophomore, freshman level mistake of college logic. And then echoing Rothbard on page 161, he says, first, it should be noted that if no one had the right to acquire and control anything except his own body, a rule that would pass the formal universalization test, then all would cease to exist, and the problem of justification for normative statements simply would not exist. Again, that's not true. Animals do not have the right, quote unquote, as libertarians will tell us, to own the things that they need for life, and yet they don't cease to exist. And I forgot to mention this because Fezer mentioned this about Rothbard. Just because we need something doesn't mean we have a right to something. We need food, we need education, and libertarians are very fond of telling us that need does not determine right. So then what needs become rights? That's something they never explain. And so we have that problem. Now, Bob Murphy wrote in conjunction with Gene Callahan, wrote a very thorough and thoughtful critique of argumentation ethics. And I think the core element of that argument is, well, Hoppe proves too little, right? At most, Hoppe proves that anybody who seeks to use coercion argue for the use of coercion against you, would only be committing a contradiction if he wanted to coerce those organs of your body necessary for debate and speech. So your brain, your mouth, your ears, and your tongue. If they wanted to conscript you to go to the army, you don't need any of those to shoot a gun and fire. So no contradiction arises. And in fact, you only demonstrate control of those organs so long as you're using them in the debate. As soon as the debate's over, presumably you don't have control of them anymore. And in that same essay, he points out that David Friedman points out that just because you don't own your body, i.e. a slave, you can still argue for your own freedom. So either Hoppe proves too little or nothing at all, or I would even argue too much. Because there's something else that if there's any implicit assumption in civil debate, the implicit assumption is a sufficient level of education. So if we don't have a sufficient level of education, then we can't have a civil debate with each other. So, by some a priori axiom, what Hoppe is really proving implicitly is that we have a right to education, which no libertarian, including Hoppe, would accept. Logos, your thoughts?
Yeah, working backwards a little bit, that reasoning for the right to education actually sounds like something that Marx wrote and Marx believed in. So, I mean, if that's the way they're going to go, then yeah, bad times ahead. Yes, the logical thing. Yeah, I think I was one of the ones that pointed out the logical negation problem to you about that. How you can't negate everybody has a right to X and get nobody has a right to X. Now, in thinking about this further, I actually thought about this either late last night or early this morning. You know me, I can't help but try to be charitable even to my worst enemies. I think the implicit assumption here, which Hoppe did not make very clear for the reader at all, is that he's assuming the truth of moral universalism. Now, I don't think he ever proved the truth of moral universalism, like at all. At best he said, emotive ethics are bad and, we can take this universalist position. But What this disagreement might come down to is just whether or not one is a moral universalist, first and foremost. Because here's a problem. If you're a moral universalist, then whatever moral proposition you make has to apply to everybody, right? So, of the four, everybody has a right to X, nobody has a right to X, some have a right to X, some don't have a right to X. The latter two, the some peoples, have to be excluded from the conversation if you assume universal morality, basically. So they're gone, like a priori, out of the conversation. And so he's left with this framework where he has to work in terms of everybody's or nobody's. And then, with the law of the excluded middle, given that universal framework, the negation of an everybody gets X is a nobody gets X. And so what looks like a logical faux pas, a major one, might just be a poorly argued assumption of the universal moral principle applied in this case. But if that's the case, then it's hard to see it's hard to see why someone skeptical of libertarianism in this way should take the moral universal case. There could be good arguments for it. I mean, Kant argued for it and others have, but why should somebody agree to the moral universal precept in the first place? Why should they agree to exclude the other two from the conversation in the first place? That has to be argued for very carefully before you can jump to more advanced claims that just say, we're going to hand wave away half of the very important quantifiers in logic as applied to people. And he didn't do that. He didn't put in the work. The other problem too. Oh,
No, go ahead.
Okay, and the other problem too is the proving too much or too little cases. He doesn't really believe everything he's saying, right? He doesn't believe that everybody has the right to uninvited coercion. What if somebody's on his property, right? And trying to steal his stuff or kidnap his daughter or something, right? He might like private security on his behalf to deal with that person, or he might deal with that person, or somebody might deal with that person. So he's got one of two options here. He has to say, well, that person did invite this by trespassing on property. They did invite this because they asked for it in some capacity, or he has to deny his principle. So since time is of the essence here, let's quickly just deal with one of the horns because the other one's obviously wrong. But suppose he does think that they're inviting this on themselves. Well, now we have this problem where we don't actually have this universalizable moral right. We have this weird quasi-conditional right to some people in which some people can do something under which they invite this thing on themselves. And that's really not where Hoppe wants to end up, because now we just kick the can down the road in a massive way. We showed that the N.A.P isn't actually fundamental, because now the question becomes what does invited aggression look like? And so if the N.A.P is, nobody has the right to uninvitedly aggress other people, and we have this non-trivial example where the clause invited aggression now becomes very, very relevant, the N.A.P isn't properly basic, it's not a principle, and it actually ends up being derivative of this very concept of invited aggression. We've kicked the can down the road. The problem is Hoppe doesn't really give us this really good framework, at least in this section, which is supposed to be the first principles one. Maybe he does later in the book or earlier or something. I didn't see in that chapter a good framework of what invited aggression looks like. Under what conditions are people asking for it? Which again brings me to my next catch-22 problem that's inherent to all these N.A.Ps. Just consider the possibility. Like, look, libertarians are always saying, like, no land should be publicly or federally owned. Every land should be privatizable. Okay, sure, let's go with that. Let's consider a hypothetical where all land is private and thus all land is owned by somebody. Then every step you take is at somebody else's expense. Now, here's where this gets interesting. If all land is owned and every step you take is on somebody else's property, it has to be by their permission, because otherwise you could be aggressing on their property without their permission, and you have a very real risk of inviting aggression on your body. But if this is so, we have the other problem in which there are no instances in principle in which a person recently born into a time where property is owned by somebody else, for that person, there are no instances which aggression is uninvited on their property. Or on the flip side, all aggression on their body that would be done by property owners of whose property they trespass is invited. And so if Hoppe's framework here is true, it's only vacuously true in the case of this person, right? If there were uninvited aggressions, they shouldn't be performed on this person. But vacuously, there is no such thing as this person, so you're never violating the rule. For the audience that doesn't know of a vacuous truth, here's a really simple example. An empty set is a subset of every set. Why? Because for something to be a subset, for A to be a subset of B, it cannot be the case that there's something in A that's not in B. Well, an empty set has nothing in it, so you'll never find something in the empty set that's not in any other set, right? Because it has no elements. So it's the condition for being a subset's vacuously satisfied, i.e. it's satisfied in a non-practical sense, kind of like a definitive sense. And in this example, there's no practical sense in which this guy is free from uninvited aggression, because he gets to be aggressed on all the time. It's just always invited because everything he does is under the guy's in control of somebody else. And so it again gets into this really, really bad catch-22 problem that seems to be inherent in all the naps.
Yeah. I think what I would want to end with is, since we are really nearing the end of the hour, is if we want to argue that the denial of all SSP is no SSP or vice versa, then the socialists could easily argue the denial of anybody, the denial of everybody having food, clothes, shelter, and education logically necessarily entails that nobody gets food, clothes, shelter, and an education, which is, of course, patently absurd, but would be consistent with the logical apparatus that Hoppe has given us, which I think, without getting, I mean, I can't really get into this because I haven't read Appel or Habermas, but I believe part of the reason why argumentation ethics proves communism is because it was intended to, and Hoppe just failed to hijack a socialist argument. What are your final thoughts, Lagos?
I don't know enough about the history of these arguments. You've read way more than I have. I just want to remind the audience basically of the highlights here, because I see in discussions libertarian all the time. Okay, you have these technical problems with the N.A.P, right? What are the practical concerns? How does this relate to political philosophy? Is this just axiomatic armchair philosophizing with no end result? And so I really want to bring the audience back to the main streams that we have seen as criticisms of all the N.A.Ps, everything in common here. Let's tie this in a bow, right? Number one, the catch-22 problem inherent in all N.A.Ps, in which the N.A.P is supposed to be some human right that humans have, but generally speaking, there's some implicit condition that a human could fail to live up to. And there is a gap in the N.A.P which allows them to fail to live up to it. And so you could make it get humans in a situation where you would be under the scope of the N.A.P if you had this thing apply to you that allowed you to be under the scope of the N.A.P, but you don't, so you're not. So practically speaking, the N.A.P, contra Rothbard, Hoppe's, and so on fears, the N.A.P can be used very much so as a dehumanizing tool, contra to what they claim it doesn't do. And I gave it very concrete examples for this in all three of the examples. Let's review them briefly. For the first one, the question is animals and the catch-22 with the dilemma that me and Todd kind of set up there, right? If you look at Rothbard's thing, the question is, why do humans have these rights that animals don't? And I gave the example of the kid, kind of the baby captured and feralized in a cage, keeping him from meeting Hoppe's rationality criterion and self-directedness criterion in the non-animalistic sense, right? That would be an example in which you could take a human baby, dehumanize the human, and keep him forever out of the scope of the N.A.P. Dangerous. The second one, Kinsella, the example, the more and more real by the year example in terms of neuroscience, where you can sedate somebody who came in to contract for an operation, put them under, they wake up with a bunch of electrodes and magnets controlling their body and brain and making them a puppet of somebody else, meaning they gave up their objective link because they thought they were agreeing to a contract. A party broke the contract. They now end up with no recourse to sue or protest the contract because they no longer have an objective link to their body. Therefore, they have excluded themselves by accident from the N.A.P. Good job. Hoppe's example of invited aggression, where what Hoppe will want to do is talk about how there is this universal rule of no uninvited aggression, but there are ways that people can invite aggression on themselves. Here are some catch-22 ways in which that can happen. All property is owned by somebody. So that's the practical application for me, is the potential dehumanizing aspect in catch-22 in all instances of the N.A.P I've ever seen, probably will ever see, because of what the N.A.P tries to exclude, which we will talk about in part 2. But I think that is the highlight for me.
All right. Thank you again, Logos. The last thing I'll say is that no one should believe in the N.A.P because the N.A.P has never been proven. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.